if you allow anyone to say that they are whichever sex they choose, you will end up moving rapists into women's jails. Like, that's just like a theorem, you know? And it doesn't even take very many steps. And I thought, as soon as I said that to somebody who said trans women are women, that if I said to them, yeah, but if that's the case, then we will end up putting rapists in women's jails, they would go, oh, yeah, I didn't think about that. Turns out they don't. Turns out people don't give a fuck. They don't care about prisoners, I think. I don't think it's they don't care about women prisoners particularly. I think it's prisoners. Yeah. So it's a black box. Prisons are black boxes. You don't see what goes on inside them, but you're pretty sure pretty terrible things go on inside them.
And there's an undertone of, well, those people deserve it.
And not always just an undertone. I mean, even people who think of themselves as good, liberal people who believe in the rule of law and so on will say that, you know, a paedophile deserves what he gets in prison. That surprised me because I don't think that. Like, I believe in the rule of law. I think, you know, we have a justice system because we don't want that sort of extrajudicial way of thinking about things. I'm sorry, I just don't think it's right. And then when you think about women in prison, you don't even need to be thinking about the arguments about whether paedophiles deserve what they get in prison. Because women in prison are so unlike men in prison. Like, one day I looked at the statistics and I thought, you know, there is nowhere you will see the difference between men and women more, except on the maternity ward. So if you look at prisons, right, nearly all prisoners are men, like 96%, something like that. And of those, about a fifth are sex offenders. So you've got tens of thousands of violent prisoners who are men and maybe 20,000-ish or 15,000-ish who are in for a sex offence. Now, we know that most rapes don't get reported. We know that even the ones that get reported don't lead to convictions. So loads of the other prisoners are going to be rapists too. They just weren't ever caught. Because these are violent men who are willing to break the law, right? Some of them will be rapists. Yeah. Tens of thousands of rapists, right? You've got 4,000 women, roughly, 3,500, 4,000 women, mostly in there for non-payment of fines, often TV licence, soliciting, drug offences, theft, that sort of thing. Most of them have experienced domestic violence. You know, most of them have suffered very much at the hands of men, you know, specifically. Very few violent offences and really almost no sexual offences. And the sexual offences are often in partnership with somebody else. Women who go to jail for sex offences, it's often that they worked with a man to create child pornography. Or, you know, they were soliciting, they were part of a brothel type situation. It's not because they force themselves on people. It's hard for women to force themselves on people. Anyway, so you just took unbelievably different populations and add to that the fact that men are much, much stronger than women. Now you've got some men that you can say, would you like to say that you're a woman and move over there? Like, male prisons are not very nice. Like, I don't know how naive you have to be to not think that this is going to lead to some strategic decisions to transition.
Do you think they're not naive, or I interpret it as they don't want to think like that? So, for instance, it's like, you know, the migrant crisis, where you hear somebody on the left go, I think they should just all be allowed to come here. And you go, well, you're not really thinking about the long-term implications. You're not thinking about the impact that's going to have on people. You're not thinking about the impact that's going to have on what's going to happen further down the line.
You're just showing your care for people who are struggling.
I think that's not a good analogy because, you know, solving the migrant crisis would actually take serious effort. Like, you'd actually have to do something and you'd have to spend money and you'd have to think about policies and you'd have to accept, you know, maybe more or fewer drownings, but some drownings, whatever. Like, it's tough. Tough choices have to be made. There's no tough choices here. We've got male prisons and female prisons. There's literally no problem. We were doing it the right way before. I think it's, you know, this word privilege is overused, but it's mostly just badly used. It's privilege. It's the fact that the people who are talking about this are never going to be there themselves. You are looking at the people who are in the hardest situation in the world when you're looking at some of the prisoners, especially these women in prison. You know, these are women who are away from their partners, their children, their partners have left them, you know. It's just people that, you know, like, I'm never going to be there. And so if you are attached to this ideology for reasons to do entirely with virtue signalling, in my opinion, this is a very inconvenient thought, the thought that prisons are a place that show that this was a bad thing to do. And the thing about prisons is you can lock them off. They're black boxes. You can just not pay attention to what's inside them. So they do. You know, it's a price that you're willing for someone else to pay.
Well, exactly, right. And I suppose this is where the conversation about the erotic side of it comes in, because Are you arguing that there are no people who might be claiming to be a trans woman who are also not a threat?
No, I'm not claiming that at all.
No.
No.
I didn't think you were, but I
Yeah.
just wanted to check.
Yeah, so I don't think that trans women who are men are any more or any less likely in general to be threats than men.
Okay.
Right?
But because they are men, they're a threat.
Exactly. Men commit nearly all the violent crime. Men commit nearly all the sexual offences. Men are much stronger than women. But also, it's not just about threat. Like, I think whenever I talk about prisons to policymakers, somebody will say, but how many rapes are there? Or you talk about changing rooms, they'll say, how many rapes are there? I mean, we have changing rooms and separate prisons partly to stop rapes, but also just because it's kind of embarrassing undressing in front of people of the opposite sex.
Yeah.
Like, you know, modesty is a thing, and most people feel more comfortable in intimate situations with people of the same sex. You know, it's not that you necessarily, I mean, like if in my workplace, if we were to switch to go gender-neutral toilets, I actually don't think I'll work with anybody at The Economist who would have caused me problems. I still don't want them in the bloody changing rooms with me. If they're men, it's that simple. So, yeah, I mean...
The reason I raise that point is, I suppose my concern there would be that a trans woman who is just a trans woman, right, being forced to be in a male prison, makes her very vulnerable.
Yeah, you make a very, very good point.
Or them, or her.
Yeah, whatever.
You say whatever pronoun you want.
Yeah.
That person is going to be much more vulnerable as a result simply of the fact that they identify as trans.
Well, probably as a result of the fact that they appear feminine or female to whatever extent they do.
Yeah.
So that's an excellent point, and that points the way that we should think about these problems. So, you know, if trans women are women, then trans women belong in women's prisons. Whereas if we accept that trans women are an unusually vulnerable group of men, well, then we think, how do we deal with this unusually vulnerable group of men? And actually, prisons have a lot of groups of vulnerable men. Young men are very vulnerable in prison. Gay men are very vulnerable in prison. Police officers are very vulnerable. So, by the way, are paedophiles and other sex offenders. And this is not me saying that trans women are sex offenders. I just mean that prisons manage very vulnerable groups. They may have to manage gangs. They try and keep drugs out. You know, this is just another vulnerable group of men and should be thought of that way. So, for example, perhaps a separate wing would be a good answer.